Okay, so first, we'll talk about the handout in a minute. First off, I'm sorry that the bottom of some of the pages got cut off. It's just that happens sometimes in the lab upstairs when you try to print out web pages. It won't actually matter functionally for what we're doing with this. But right, so everybody got the assignment for next time, right?
Oh, yes.
So we're moving on to poetry. Right, I've got 3 short poems for you to read. And the thing I want you to focus on in particular with these 3 poems, the thing I really want you to think about, right, is who is the speaker in this poem, right? Poems do not have narrators. Poems have speakers. And the speaker is never to be too closely identified with the poet, right? Even if the speaker is the poet or someone like the poet, right, the speaker is always an invented persona, right? It's an invented mask. So what you want to think about as you're reading these poems is, who is the speaker, right? What information does the speaker provide about himself or herself, right? What can we guess about this person based on what they say? So, the poetry we're going to be looking at in this particular class, right, is going to come from the category that we call lyric. Right? There is narrative poetry. Right? There is such a thing as narrative poetry. I mean, how many of you have read Beowulf or the Odyssey or the Iliad, or Paradise Lost, or Dante's Inferno, anything like that? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. So yeah.
Not Paradise Lost.
Those two, so all of those poems, they're written in verse, right? But they tell a story, right, with a distinct beginning, middle, and end, and with characters and with action and all that sort of thing, right?
Then how is it classified as a poem?
Because it's written in verse.
Because it rhymes.
Stories can rhyme?
No. Otherwise, it's not a story.
It's a pardon?
I said the Odyssey rocks.
Good.
That was a good one.
Good.
I like the movie.
I remember a TV movie from the 90s. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Yes.
With Armand Asante?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
That one's pretty awesome.
What?
The movie.
Right, so,
Were the 3 men that are like escaping from jail or whatever?
no, you're thinking of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Yes.
Not Farrelly brothers, they were the comedians. Who the hell are they? The Fargo guys, and their brothers.
They were.
Oh, who cares? It doesn't matter. Anyway, it's based loosely on the Odyssey. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is based loosely on the Odyssey. So poetry can be used to compose narrative. In fact, most early narratives are in verse because they come out of oral tradition and it's easier to remember rhyme and alliteration and rhythm than it is to remember prose. But lyric poetry, which is what we're going to be concerned with, is focused on either expression of a particular idea or emotion or state of mind, or revelation of the speaker's character, right? In some cases, a lyric poem is going to be a kind of character study of the person speaking. Yeah, you are not going to find any kind of conventional plot in a lyric poem, so don't look for one, right? Don't look for it to tell you a story. Now, what sorts of things, you all had to read some poetry in high school, I imagine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what sorts of things do you imagine poetry is typically about?
We're talking about like Edgar Allan Poe, or actually no.
Well, Poe wrote poetry, right?
Yeah.
I mean, some of you have probably read The Raven, right?
Yeah.
Or listened to someone read The Raven.
Yeah.
Okay.
Say that.
There's an episode of The Simpsons
Yeah.
where they do The Raven, yeah. Okay, so yeah, Poe's poetry tends to follow the same kind of pattern that his short stories do, right? It's, usually, dark and creepy, melancholy moods, fierce and bizarre creatures that symbolize, fearsome concepts, right? What other sorts of things, if you had to boil a poem down to what is most typical based on what you've read, what would you suggest the poems are usually about?
Expressing personal feelings.
Okay, feelings. Okay. All right, feelings. What else? Any particular things you expect from a poem, you expect to be in a poem?
It needs to rhyme.
Yeah.
Okay, you expect rhyme.
I know it doesn't have to be a poem, but it should be.
If it don't rhyme, I ain't reading it.
It takes so much less skill to do it without rhyming.
It really does.
Poems that don't rhyme actually often use other sound patterns to link up ideas. Like you will, for example, find in like old Anglo-Saxon poetry, right? It's actually hard to rhyme in modern English, and it's even harder to rhyme in Old English because there are no regular word endings, right? It's super easy to rhyme in Romance languages, in French, in Spanish, in Italian, because nouns and verbs have very regular endings. In English, we don't have that. Germanic languages generally don't have that. So it's nearly impossible to rhyme in Old English. So what they would do instead was alliterate within a line. So yeah, there will be, even if there isn't rhyme, there will often be repetition of sound patterns or rhythms. And Walt Whitman, who largely sort of introduced quote-unquote free verse into English language poetry, wasn't just spouting out words either. He was imitating the cadences of the King James Bible. He was trying to he wasn't rhyming, but he was trying to imitate the rhythms of biblical verse, the Psalms and whatnot. So there is often a logic at work, even if you don't see it. Right? What kinds of imagery do you usually expect in a poem?
I like light and dark comparisons.
Okay, comparative,
Metaphors.
light, dark, metaphor.
Some sort of theme.
Okay. Certainly if you're thinking like a formalist, right? There's going to be some theme that runs through the poem. You guys are actually thinking on a much more meta level than I'm used to when I introduce this material with the class, right? So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of poems to demonstrate what sorts of things a poem can be about and how poems can often be written about things that we wouldn't expect a poem to be written about. And I'm going to warn you, this first one you're probably going to find pretty offensive.
Good.
I have chosen one of the mildest possible translations of it.
Go to the angriest translation.
No, I've done that and that got me in trouble. So we don't use that anymore.
Do it.
Anybody here gonna get butthurt?
Anybody what?
I said, is anybody here gonna get butthurt if we watch something?
No. No.
Do it.
I've heard worse.
I'm pretty sure I'll stick worse.
Alright, so this is a poem by the Roman poet Catullus.
Straightforward. That was straightforward.
Right?
Yeah.
Up yours and sucks to the pair of you, Queen Aurelius, furious the faggot, who dare judge me on the basis of my verses. They mayn't be many, does that make me indecent? Squeaky clean, that's what every proper poet's person should be, but not his bloody squiblets, which, in the last resort, lack salt and flavor, if not unmanly, and rather less than decent. Just the ticket to work a furious itch up, I won't say in boys, but in those hirsute clods, incapable of wiggling their hard haunches. Just because you've read about my countless thousand kisses, you think I'm less than virile? Up yours, and sucks to the pair of you.
Somebody was against what he was writing.
Yeah, so this is an attack on two critics, right? People who have criticized his verses. Now, what do they seem to have criticized his verses for?
Talking about his many lovers.
Okay, yeah, so Catullus's poems are mostly love poems, with the notable exception of this. And most of them are a little bit on the salty side, right?
No, like raunchy?
Yeah. The Latin original of this is actually way filthier than what we've got here.
Can we read it?
If you want to go read it on your own, go for it. I'm not going to give it to you. But the idea here, the point that I'm trying to make here, is that poetry can be about virtually anything, right? I mean, this poem is an insult, right? It's an attack on two people the poet dislikes. Now, the other point I want to make about this is that context matters a great deal when you are trying to read a poem. Whatever, the formalists say about it, right? Context actually is important. You can get things out of this that you wouldn't if you knew nothing about ancient Roman gender discourses. For example, what's your father's name?
Mickey?
Mickey? All right, so short for Michael?
No.
Oh, it's just Mickey?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, let's pretend it's short for Michael because that makes this easier. So if you were an ancient Roman woman, your name would simply be Michaela. Feminine form of your father's name.
Oh, wow.
And if you had a younger sister, you would be Michaela Prima, and she would be Michaela Secunda. Right? Women didn't have their own personal names. What this indicates, right, is that men counted for pretty much everything in Roman society. So one of the worst things you could call somebody was unmanly or womanly, right? And that is why the poet insists so fiercely here on his virility, right? Yeah, Slayton.
So what's a squiblet?
A squiblet?
Is that like the lines of the poem?
Yeah, it's like a term for a short poem, right? It's a sort of casual way of talking about a short poem.
Never would have
It's like
guessed
the
that.
poet himself, the person should be squeaky clean, but not his writing.
Yeah, that the fact that the poet's writing is dirty doesn't necessarily mean that his person is dirty, right?
In the last resort, like salt.
So yeah, one thing that he's doing here is separating the stuff of poetry from the stuff of life, right? Look, poetry is art. You can make things up. It's more interesting if you make things up. The fact that my poems are dirty doesn't mean that my life is. But yeah, the important thing to get here, the real reason for writing the poem is in the first place, is that his masculinity has been insulted, right?
I mean, yeah.
And that he feels he needs to push back against that. So if you know a little something about how the ancient Romans thought about gender, right, that adds a dimension to the poem that if you just found this in a book and didn't know this, you wouldn't get, right? Yeah, Alan.
What does that line starting with "I won't say in boys" mean?
Okay, so
I don't understand that.
you got to read the whole sentence, right? So, squeaky clean, that's what every proper poet's person should be, but not as bloody squiblets, which, in the last resort, lack salt and flavor, if not unmanly, and rather less indecent. Just the ticket to work a furious itch-up, I won't say in boys, but in those hirsute clods incapable of wiggling their hard haunches. So basically what the point of the whole sentence is that poetry is supposed to make you a little bit horny.
Ooh.
That's the point of his sentence, right?
I mean,
What's
I am not suggesting that is what the purpose of poetry is, right?
Oh,
But that is what Catullus is suggesting the point of poetry is, right? Okay, so to give you another example, and to go in a completely different direction with this, which I think we need.
Is that Latin?
What's that?
Was that Latin?
No.
I'll show you Latin.
So I'm going to give you the earliest poem known to be written in the English language, right? It's composed supposedly spontaneously by an illiterate stable hand named Caedmon.
Illiterate.
Yes, well, somebody else can write it down for him. And this is what it looks like in the original, right? Nuve schulen herien, jontriges word, metatus micta in his mud gethank, work wolder feder, swahi wonder gewis, Ecke dritten ord an stalde. Herest geschuff korthen bjarnum, hjoffen te vrofe, halig shippend, the middengeerd monkenes werd, Ecke dritten efter theode, virum folden vreal miktig. Right? So yes, this is English, right?
Oh no.
But this is Anglo-Saxon.
Oh no.
It sounds Germanish.
Yeah, it
This
does.
is Germanic language.
Yeah. This is English. This is English before. You remember weeks and weeks and weeks ago we talked about the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and how it changed the English language?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is what English looked like before.
In
That
1065.
would be awesome.
Yes, in 1065, yeah. So this is what English looks like before it becomes, it absorbs influences from Latin and French, right? So this is what the poem looks like rendered in modern English, right? Praise now to the keeper of the kingdom of heaven, the power of the Creator, the profound mind of the glorious Father, who fashioned the beginning of every wonder, the eternal Lord. For the children of men he made first heaven as a roof, the holy Creator, then the Lord of mankind, the everlasting Shepherd, ordained in the midst as a dwelling place, Almighty Lord, the middle earth for men. So,
Oh.
this also requires a little bit of contextualizing to really pull the subtleties out of this. On the one hand, right, we have God portrayed as a keeper of a kingdom, like a sort of a guardian, like a warlord kind of figure, right, who watches over his people, protects his people, protects his men, right? We also have him here as a builder, right, who builds a kind of house or mead hall in the middle of creation, with heaven as a roof. Now, this is drawn directly from the old Germanic pagan idea of what the universe looked like. Right? It was supposed to be a giant tree, growing up, with its roots down in the world of the dead, and its branches up in the heavens. And in the middle of the tree, built like a house, was Midgard, Middle Earth, the world of human beings. And right up above that, right, in the branches that formed the roof, was Asgard, the world of the gods.
Where's Valhalla?
Valhalla is in Asgard.
Asgard.
Yep.
Boy.
So
Boy.
I like
So,
Greek mythology. not
what
Norse.
we're getting here, right, is these older concepts being translated into a new Christian context, right? We can see that at the time this poem is written, Christianity is a new religion to the Angles and the Saxons. And so they're still understanding it largely in terms of the religion they followed before, right? And that's working its way into the poem. We do have a mixture of that sort of with more conventional Christian imagery as well, right? The idea of, the Lord as the everlasting shepherd, right? That's not something that would have come out of an Anglo-Saxon tradition. They tend to write poems about sort of Jesus as a warrior who dies to protect his men, right? Who dies to protect his comrades. Because that's something closer to the worldview they were coming out of, right? They take the material and recontextualize it so that it makes sense to them. And again, if you don't know these things about Anglo-Saxon culture, then you miss the point of the poem, right? You miss what's actually most interesting about the poem. So, one last thing I want to do with this, and then we'll talk a little bit about the handout. I'm going to show you two poems written around the same time, with the same title, about the same subject. Right? They're both about this statue that was taken from Egypt to the British Museum in London in the early 19th century. So what I want you to do is look at the two poems side by side. One of them is, considered a literary classic that always, pops up in anthologies and Brit Lit survey courses and courses on romantic literature, right? The other is a largely forgotten imitation. So what I want you to do is read the two poems and tell me which is which. Now, if you recognize one of them and already know the answer, keep that to yourself. But, yeah, read the two together, and once you've done that, tell me which one is which, and explain to me why you've chosen that one, right? Why you think that's the correct one.
Cool.
I think the one on the left is the one that's the literary.
Your left or my left?
Our left.
The one that says I met a traveler.
Okay. Why do you think that is the classic, Alan?
Because it's longer.
Well,
They're the same length.
And I remember those last 5
They're,
lines.
they're both sonnets. They're exactly the same length.
That one seems to be written directly describing the statue itself. The other one's kind of the contextual stuff around it. It like
Okay.
even mentions London.
Uh-huh.
So it's more like a stand back type, this is what went down, that one's all about the statue.
Okay, so this one is much more focused on the image and the power of the image.
Yeah.
And then, and this one is more about sort of telling you what's going on around the image.
Yeah.
Okay, does anybody disagree? Does anybody think that this one is the classic?
Okay. It could be.
It could be because he's asking that question.
Oh God.
No, I just want to make sure. Yeah, Grady, what's up?
So is the question like which one's the oldest one, like the oldest version?
No, it's not which one is the older version, but which one is the one that discerning readers of poetry consider better.
I mean, I feel like I can understand it a bit more from the one to the left rather than to the one with the right, because on the right it speaks in a kind of way that it just seems kind of ancient or just older to me when it says
Okay.
words like want or whatever.
So this one sounds like it's trying to sound old-fashioned
yeah,
or trying to use fancy words.
but it just seems older.
Okay, so it seems, but that might also be artificial, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes poets do that to achieve a particular effect. Edgar Allan Poe, right, for example, does that shit all the time. So yeah, I'm gonna say, yeah, Alan's right. This is the classic poem. It's called Ozymandias by Percy Shelley.
Too long to be wrong.
And it's considered superior basically for exactly the reasons you stated, right? Yeah, that it is just, it focuses on the image and lets you draw your own conclusions about that image, right? It doesn't tell you what to think. It illustrates for you what the image is supposed to mean, right? Okay, you've got this message carved on the pedestal, which is just a broken statue in the middle of a wasteland, right? That, the power of kings is fleeting, right? The power of any society is fleeting. Now, this poem comes out and tells you explicitly that that's exactly what it means, right? It spends a lot less time on the image and more time explaining the image. So the ambiguity of the first poem, right, the fact that it just presents the image and lets you come to your own conclusions, that would make it the superior poem. Also, the things that you notice they're great at, like sort of the more old-fashioned language. There's also a much more conventional rhyme scheme in the second poem, right? What this shows is a poet, you know, who has some skill, but he's still sort of playing around with artificiality a little too much. Right, so yeah, your impulses were actually really good on this one, so good job. Give yourselves a hand. Yay.
Oh, it was wonderful.
Okay, so just briefly now then, I want to look at this handout that I gave you. There is actually some decent practical advice for reading a poem on here.
That's good.
Some of it's tongue-in-cheek. Some of it is actually valuable. Okay, so if we look at number 2 here, right? When you read a poem, especially a poem not meant to be a spoken word poem, always read it out loud. Never mind what they said in grammar school to subvocalize so you won't bother your peers. Your ear will pick up more than your head will allow. That is, the ear will tell the mind what to think. So even poetry that was written specifically to be read and not to be spoken, right? You will get more out of it if you read it out loud. You will get more out of it if you hear it than you will if you just read it quietly, right? Poetry is often about sound and sounds that repeat, whether it's rhyme, whether it's alliteration, whether it's assonance or consonance, right? Sounds link ideas together in particular ways. And you will sometimes miss that if you just read the poem on the page. Now, another thing that you will typically miss if you're just reading the poem on the page, in terms of repeated sounds, is sounds that don't quite repeat but look like they're supposed to. So I'll give you an example. Are any of you familiar with a poem by Christopher Marlowe called The Passionate Shepherd to His Love? Did any of you have to read that in high school?
It doesn't ring a bell.
No, it doesn't ring a bell. Okay. Well, it starts with the lines, "Come live with me and be my love, and we will all our pleasures prove."
Ooh. Disgusting. You improve.
So what we have here is an example of what's called an I rhyme. Words that look like they're supposed to rhyme if you just read them. When you actually speak them, don't. And I rhymes are a kind of little sleight of hand that poets often use to indicate that they're not quite being honest, right? That they're playing some kind of little trick on you. Right? It's drawing attention to the artificiality of the poem. So you want to watch for these kinds of things, right? If you see things like I rhyme in a poem, that's often an indication, okay, there's something going on in these lines that isn't immediately obvious, right? So you want to listen. Number 3 here, right? Try to read a poem on its terms, not yours. If you have to relate to a poem to understand it, you aren't reading it sufficiently. In other words, don't try to fit the poem into your life. Try to see what world the poem creates. Then, if you are lucky, its world will help you re-see your own. I would tone this back a little bit to just to say, like, context matters, right? Context is important. Just as we did with the Catullus poem and with Caedmon's hymn, right? You get a lot more out of those poems if you understand, to some extent, the world in which they're coming from. Number 4, whether or not you are conscious of it, you are always looking for an excuse to stop reading a poem and move on to another poem or to do something else entirely. Resist this urge as much as possible. Think of it as a Buddhist regards a pesky mosquito. The mosquito, like the poem, may be irritating, but it's not going to kill you to brave it for a little while longer. Look, reading poetry requires sustained attention, right? You're not going to catch a lot of the subtleties of the poem on a first quick read through. You remember early in the semester, I had you guys sit and stare at visual images for what seemed like an eternity to try to pull as much as you could out of those, right? But the longer you sit there, right, the more you stare at that image, the more you do get out of it, or you start noticing things you didn't see originally. Your eye starts picking up, little subtleties, little cues that were invisible to you when you first looked at it. Poetry works the same way, right? You will pick up on things if you keep rereading it and if you keep paying close attention to it. All right, what else? Let's see. Okay, number 8. A poem has no hidden meaning, only meanings you've not yet realized are right in front of you. Discerning subtleties takes practice. Reading poetry is a convention like anything else, and you learn the rules of it like anything else, e.g. driving or baking a cake, right? So you'll get better at this with practice. And, today I've tried to give you a little bit of scaffolding for reading poetry. I'll give you more on Monday, right? I'll give you more sorts of specific things that you can look for. But yeah, everything the poem says is right in front of you, either in the language or in the way the language is put together, the rhyme, the meter, what have you. All right, let's see, what else, right? Okay, number 13 is actually really important, right? Perform marginalia, right? Write in the book. You'll get a lot more out of the poem if you find yourself having like a little conversation with it, right? Sit and actually make notes on the poem, right? If you see a word that seems to have, pardon?
Unless it's not.
Okay, yeah, don't write in library books. You print a copy and write on that, yes. I actually have written in library books, I probably shouldn't admit that. Right, so, the point is though, right, you see, a word in the poem that has a rich range of connotations, right? So, underline the word. Write down in the margin what those connotations are, right? You see some sort of, you notice an interesting rhyme scheme, right? Underline the rhyming words. Think about that rhyming sound. Think about the concepts that rhyme is linking up, right? Write it down. If you read poetry in this way, right, actively, and sort of having a written verbal conversation with it, not only will you have a better chance of remembering the poem, right, you will actually develop more ideas as you're reading. And there was one, number 6 is also very, very important, right? If you don't know a word, look it up or die. Don't die, right? Don't do that. But it is very, very easy to look up a word you don't know, right? So just do that rather than skimming over it. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about any of this? So yeah, keep this to help you as you're reading these 3 poems. We're going to move on now to what I had asked you to prepare for today. So if you're in the cultural studies group, come on over here. If you're in the new historicist group, stay in the middle. If you're in the Marxist group, you are over here on my right. Mark, you see some